Before we end today's episode of Intellectual Catholicism, I do have one last thing to say and to share, and so let's do that real quick.
Hi, I'm Father Michael Lee. I am the administrator of St. Luke Byzantine Catholic Church in Sugar Creek, Missouri. And I just wanted to appeal to you today to pray about helping us in our moving project. I've been the administrator of St. Luke for the last 5 years, and in that time we basically have doubled our size. We went from a congregation of kind of the low 30s up almost into the 80s. And we're just really trying to find a new space where we can expand and grow and offer this beautiful apostolic brand of Christianity to anybody that wants to come. So we are just appealing for your help. If you would like to get in and help us to move and to grow and to be able to have this unique and beautiful expression of Catholicism, please visit our website. It's byzantinekc.org. And on the landing page, there's a donate button that will take you to another website that you can donate electronically. We really appreciate anything that you can do, and we're praying for you. God bless.
It is an absolute delight to be here today on Reason and Theology, presenting on the issue of icon veneration. Let me begin by first thanking Michael Lofton for his hospitality, having me in his studio in front of these beautiful icons. It's such a delight. The presentation that I'm giving today is going to be rather long, and so I want to prepare everybody ahead of time. This is a very thorough presentation. It's going through a lot of evidence. So my longest lecture so far has been the 4-hour Peter Eliakim lecture that had about 116 slides. This PowerPoint presentation has around 140 slides. And somebody's going to say, Suan, there's no way that Gavin's going to watch this and respond to this. You're crazy. You're expecting him to watch it. No, my expectation is simply that for anybody who's watching, who really wants a deep dive into the issues, that this PowerPoint presentation will serve that purpose. And I understand that Gavin's a busy man. He's a father. He's a pastor. And so I'm not expecting him to really sit down and watch the whole thing. But I do think the points in this lecture are important, because if he does publish his book on Protestant arguments and icon veneration, this presentation is going to be eminently important to what he's saying. And so for any sympathetic Protestant who wants to hear a full Catholic response, for any Catholic who wants to know how to respond to Gavin Ortlund, this presentation, I think, will be indispensable. And so for Michael on the other side, let's get the PowerPoint on the screen and begin the presentation. So once again, my presentation is going to be responding to Gavin Ortlund on icon veneration. I'm Suan Sonna of Intellectual Catholicism, and I'm delighted to be presenting on Reason and Theology. Let's begin. In order to prepare for this lecture, there are 2 previous ones that are going to be helpful. The first is my shorter lecture on icons and doctrinal development, where I talk about the theory of the development of doctrine and how it's going to play out. And I examine some of Gavin's sources just a little bit to see that already in the sources themselves, you see a development from at least one block saying no images in churches to, okay, you can have images in churches, to eventually, the images have further uses and purposes. The other lecture that I'm going to recommend is my presentation on Dustin Quick's channel, Holy Smokes, where I defended the ancient practice of the veneration of saints from Second Temple Jewish sources. And in that presentation, I argue that it is historically probable that the apostles would have known of the veneration of saints based on Second Temple Jewish sources. In that presentation, I don't rely upon later rabbinic sources. I'm going directly to the heart of what would have been in the environment of first century Judaism and early Christianity. And so these 2 presentations, I think, are going to be important. But let me begin with some preliminary remarks then. The first is, Suan, why Gavin? Why are you responding to him in particular? And the reason why is because Gavin, I think, has done a great service in his presentation, insofar as he has given, I think, a very interesting, thoroughly researched argument. And so I want to commend Gavin for that. I'm not being sarcastic when I say this. When I was researching for this presentation, this is among the most intense research that I've done in my life. And along the way, I found myself challenged, growing, and practicing how to be a good critical scholar. And so I want to thank Gavin for his contribution to the conversation. He really is adding something. And I think this presentation today will hopefully be matching the quality of his work. The second question is, Suan, why now? Because, Gavin posted his icons video months and months ago, and you're responding in the middle of May? What's this about? The reason why is because I took Gavin's arguments so seriously that I didn't want to just begin, a month later with a presentation without really researching and looking through everything that Gavin has said, all the arguments at play, the sources in question. And I really wanted to give this argument its fair shake. And so that's why even many months later, I'm now doing this presentation. The other thing is somebody's going to ask, Suan, why are you doing so much in response, right? This is 140 slides. This is crazy. And I want to say the first reason why I'm devoting so much attention is because this topic is of personal importance to me as a Catholic, because this is part of my tradition. This is my family's heritage. And so I want to do what I can in order to give it also its best defense. And as you see in that picture there, me talking to a Byzantine Catholic priest, Father Michael Lee of St. Luke's Byzantine Catholic Church in Sugar Creek, Missouri, a wonderful parish. Please support them as they are trying to move to a different space. When I did the research for this project, I also, not only did I read Nicaea II, but I also visited Byzantine parishes and tried to get myself into the mindset, if you will, of icon veneration. The second thing is that I'm serious about my work. And because of how serious this topic is and how deep the research is, it needs to be given its fair due. And so I know that somebody might say, Suan, Gavin's original video was like an hour and 15 minutes. Why are you going for so long? The reason why is because, once again, I'm very serious about all the points that are there. And so sometimes it's easier to ask the question than it is to hear the answer. The question can be nice and short. The answer might take pages and pages and volumes and volumes. And so I'm trying to do that hard work. The third thing is that this is actually a complicated subject and argument. And the reason why is because Nicaea II is in a different context. It is not addressing Protestants at the Reformation and post-Reformation. It is not addressing that context. Rather, it is addressing the iconoclasts of their time, who were in many ways, like the Catholic brothers have pointed out, Catholic in a lot of their beliefs, but here they weren't. And the point I'm trying to make is that they are also addressing iconoclastic arguments. And so a Protestant in the course of this video might be watching and saying, well, that's not the position. That's not Gavin's position. That's correct, because it's addressing the iconoclasts of their time. And so what I need to do then is translate from the context of Nicaea II into our present day context. It's like, for example, having to translate the New Testament from Greek to Latin and then to English, right? It's a complicated process. Rather than just going from Greek straight to the English, you have to go through all these extra steps so that you are paying attention to the context of Nicaea II and not being anachronistic in your arguments and conclusions. So the contents for today's lecture are the following. I'm going to first articulate Gavin's objections and make sure that as he's watching or as you're watching, okay, Suan does understand the objections. And if I'm mistaken, please correct me. The second thing I'm going to do is list out what my responses are to each of these objections. Then I'm going to give the thesis of the presentation. And then we'll look at two particular objections and we'll conclude from there. So let's begin with what are Gavin's objections to icon veneration. I think the first is that Gavin is arguing that Nicaea II does not allow for any developments from the apostles to the council. Nicaea II is basically saying that the apostles venerated icons like the 8th century iconophiles or iconodules. This is problematic. This is my commentary. This is problematic because development seems to be the only plausible route for a Catholic. Objection 1. Objection 2, the fathers. Gavin argues that the church fathers would not have recognized Nicaea II as a valid development, meaning that even a developmental reading here is implausible. The third objection concerns the anathemas. Gavin argues that it is wrong to anathematize fellow Christians on poor evidence, on non-salvation issues especially. And this third argument is really important because even in the debate between Trent Horn and Gavin Nortland, as I was listening to Gavin, I noticed among him and many other of my Protestant friends, a kind of moral objection to anathemas. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time to address all three of these objections. In this presentation today, I'll look at objections 1 and 2 because they both concern development and save the anathemas for another time. But my responses to each of these objections is the following. Regarding objection 1, no development. Not only is Nicaea II compatible with development, but the development interpretation is better than Gavin's interpretation of the council. Nicaea II leaves open the precise manner of apostolic icon veneration. That's important. Regarding objection to the fathers, I will offer a plausible developmental history of icon veneration from the apostles to the council, engaging along the way Gavin's uses of the sources. Regarding objection 3, the anathemas, my response is simply that the anathemas of Nicaea II were issued on reasonable grounds. Now, once again, I'm only going to be addressing the first 2 objections, but I want to make a quick comment here. So on Kyle Whittington's channel, I made the comment that I thought Trent Horn and Jimmy Akin in their response had softened the anathemas. I want to strike that from the record because the more I studied the issue, the more I realized that Jimmy and Trent were making valid points to nuance some of the presentation of Gavin on anathemas and also just the nature of anathemas in general. And so I think that they were making valid points, and I don't think that was the most charitable comment from myself. So in intellectual humility, I admit that on camera. So let's go to the thesis then of the presentation, which is simply this. There is a plausible case to be made of development from the apostles to Nicaea II on the matter of image veneration. The subpoints of the presentation are, once again, Nicaea II not only allows for, but implies development from the apostles to the council. Second, there is a plausible development in image veneration from the apostles to the council. So then let's begin with objection 1, no development. And here I want to thank the Catholic brothers because their video and their podcast on the episode concerning Gavin's lecture, this was incredible. I listened to it multiple times in visual and audio mediums, and it really helped me understand Nicaea II. So that video is such a great service. And also they went on my channel, as you see on the left thumbnail icon there, what Nicaea II really taught. And so they are a valuable resource in this conversation. They really lay out what is going on at Nicaea II, the history, the context, and the theology. That's so important. So once again, Gavin's position is that Nicaea II doesn't allow for any development. In Gavin Ortland's video on best and worst kind of responses to his icon veneration video, around the 36-37 mark, he says, you get to a point where you're really starting to defend the practice and the theology of Nicaea II by pushing against the whole way of thinking at Nicaea II, because Nicaea II did not argue for this as a development. In other words, Gavin is saying that the council is saying that the apostles venerated icons like the 8th century iconophiles. Somebody might say, but Suan, that's not what Gavin's saying. That's such a rigid understanding of his argument. But that's the thing. Gavin's objection requires that Nicaea II allows for no development. In other words, that the apostles venerated icons like the 8th century iconophiles. If not, if Gavin is saying, oh, well, Nicaea II allows for some development, then there is room for development. But precisely because Gavin is saying there is no room for development based on what Nicaea II is saying, therefore, 8th century, 1st century, no difference. As I said before, my position is that Nicaea II is compatible and that the development interpretation is better. Now, let me offer 3 reasons against Gavin's position. First, the decree of the council does not argue in the sort of way we would expect if Gavin's interpretation were correct. You can think about this as a modus tollens argument, right? If A, therefore B, not B, therefore A. So if Gavin's interpretation were correct, we would expect this. We don't see this, therefore Gavin's interpretation is not correct. Similarly, my second reason is that the sessions of the council do not present arguments of the sort we would expect if Gavin's interpretation were correct. The third reason against Gavin's position is that we can identify at minimum what must historically be true for Nicaea II's claims to survive. Now, a reason for my position. The council, I believe, does argue in a way that favors the development interpretation, and I'll explain in more detail what exactly that way is. But let's look at the decree of the council. So in the part of Father Price's wonderful translation of the Acts of the Second Council of Nicaea, this is an expensive book, so thank you to my patrons for helping me. When you get into the 7th and final session of the council, you see the horos, or the decree or definition of the council. Now, Price explains on page 548 that, decree is a better translation than definition, although Price then uses definition throughout the rest of the book. So I'm going to take Price at 548 and just use decree for the sake of the argument. And there you see, once again, my modus tollens argument articulated. So to read from Price again, Father Price, he says, sessions 1 to 6 followed a rapid sequence with a gap of only 2 or 3 days between each session and the following one. In contrast, session 7 took place a full week after the preceding session. Even if the canons were also approved during this week, this points to a delay for discussion before the text of the Horos was finalized. The text is so timid in advancing a theology of image veneration that this, canons being approved the same week, may appear improbable, but this very timidity may itself have been a result of debate. So the important thing to keep in mind with this commentary is that the Horos, or the decree or definition, is the statement of the council. Gavin will often talk about how, people were saying, well, this part's infallible, this part's not infallible. Leaving that aside for a moment, the council itself is alluding to the idea that it's really the 7th session that is the definitive summary of all the preceding sessions. And so, for example, we can know based on the amount of time that went into preparing for the final session that this is the cumulative summative thought of the council. Moreover, it is the summative statement. If I were to look at, for example, a Supreme Court ruling, if I wanted to know what the Supreme Court ruling is, I could listen to the oral arguments that would go on for hours and hours and hours, but I would really look at the majority opinion. And similarly with Nicaea II, if you want to know what is the theology, what is the ruling of Nicaea II, you would go to the decree, the majority opinion in the 7th session. Now, Father Price does say that the text is timid, and that might seem surprising to Gavin because, remember, the anathemas are issued and the triumphalist rhetoric that's there. But I think there's a point to be made here in Father Price's argument. Because, Price says that the council's appeal to unwritten tradition is, quote, an admission that the written tradition, that is the explicit teaching of the great fathers, was not adequate to establish the doctrine. So I disagree with Price there. I don't think that saying unwritten tradition is a concession of that magnitude. As I say before, this is reading too much because the council is just referencing 2 Thessalonians 2:15 and in keeping with Basil the Great's way of reasoning. And you can look at page 564, footnote 49. But Price does say that some commentators have found the Horos to be a thin and disappointing document, for what it formally lays down is not a particular doctrine about images, but simply that images are to be set up and receive veneration. We may detect behind this the cautious sobriety of Patriarch Tarasios of Constantinople, eager to minimize the grounds for subsequent contention. So notice that even if Nicaea II has triumphalist rhetoric, when you look at the actual context and what's going on, when you look at what the words are actually saying, there is a degree of caution. It's not going so far as to lay out the whole theology of image veneration. And as I'll argue further, it's very careful about what it says historically about the apostles. You need to be able to read past the rhetoric, which is what scholars do all the time with ancient documents, and look at the substance. Now, this is the contested passage, as Gavin Ortling presents around his video Best and Worst, 3609 mark. He says the following, or rather, the council says the following. The Holy Council exclaimed, once again, 7th session at the end of the decree, or near the end. We all believe accordingly. We all hold the same. We have all signed in accord. This is the faith of the apostles. This is the faith of the fathers. This is the faith of the Orthodox. This is the faith that has sustained the world. Believing in one God to be praised in Trinity, we kiss the honorable images. May those who do not hold accordingly be anathema. May those who do not believe accordingly be driven far away from the church. We follow the ancient legislation of the Catholic Church. We observe the decrees of the fathers. We anathematize those who either add anything or remove anything from the church. We anathematize the intrusive innovation of the accusers of Christians. So the interesting thing here is that what Gavin's going to emphasize is, look, when it says this is the faith of the apostles, it's saying maybe something along the lines of the apostles were venerating icons like the 8th century iconodules. This is what it is saying. But what is this in This is the Faith of the Apostles? Surprisingly enough, even though this is sounding like this is the ruling of the council, because in a way it is the ruling of the council, but it's confirming its decision. So you have to go back and look at what actually was the decision. What is the this in this is the faith of the apostles? And so that context is so important, because if you just look at this text, you might think, oh, well, it's saying image veneration in a very precise 8th century iconodual way. That's the faith of the apostles. Well, there's some flexibility there, because you need to look at what the actual decision is. So we can then ask the question, does the faith of the apostles, according to Nicaea II, include kissing images in the sense that the apostles themselves kissed images and the like? Let's look at these two questions. What is this in this is the faith of the apostles? Well, when you go back a few pages, you see the decision of Nicaea II articulated. We therefore decree with all care and precision that venerable and holy images made in colors or mosaic or other fitting materials, in the same way as the figure of the honorable and life-giving cross, are to be dedicated in the holy churches of God, on sacred vessels and vestments, on walls and panels, in houses and in the streets, namely, the image of our Lord and God and Savior Jesus Christ, of our Immaculate Lady, the Holy Theotokos, and of honorable angels and all the holy and sacred men. So the decision of the council has three parts. The first is that you have here that there are venerable and holy images. The second is that they can be in churches. The third is that they can be imitations or depictions of certain persons. So these are the three things that Nicaea II is saying, this is the faith of the apostles. That is that there are venerable and holy images that can be in churches of saints. That's the decision. So when we look at these three parts of the decree, let's keep asking ourselves the question, but in what sense are 1 to 3 apostolic or the faith of the apostles? Were the apostles installing images in churches exactly as the 8th century iconodules were doing? Or did the apostles simply acknowledge that there could be such a category as venerable and holy images in Christian liturgy? Apostolic could mean something as strict as one-for-one historical correspondence, 1st century, 8th century, exactly the same. Or it could mean apostolic in the sense of, for example, if I'm to preach the gospel, well, yes, Suan is preaching the apostolic doctrine. He is preaching the substance and theology of what the apostles are saying. It's not saying that Suan's sermon or homily is literally word for word what Paul preached or Peter preached, right? But it's the substance, it's the general core. And so we can then go to the second question now. Does the faith of the apostles include kissing images in the sense that the apostles themselves kissed images and the like? Well, let's look at the reasoning of the decree. We need to look at the text and understand it fully. So when it gives the reasoning for the decision, Nicaea II begins by affirming the Christology of the previous councils. It then goes on to talk about sacred art being apostolic and profitable. So it says the following, quote, "We preserve without innovation all the traditions of the church that have been laid down for us, whether written or unwritten. One of these is reproduction in painted images as something that is in harmony with the narration of the gospel message for the confirming of the real and in no way phantasmal incarnation of God the Word, and which serves us by conferring the same benefit." So notice here that Nicaea II is explicitly saying that something does go back to the apostles. What is that something? Reproduction in painted images. It's saying that specific thing does go back to the apostles. Okay, that's something, but does it say anywhere explicitly that the apostles were venerating icons like the 8th century iconodules? Let's look further. The second point to make up the second point is that it's saying sacred art is sanctifying. It has a valid cultic purpose. It has a real positive place in the life of a Christian. Quote, "For it is to be the extent that they are constantly seen, that is the saints through depiction and images, that those who behold them are spurred to remember and yearn for their prototypes." All right, so sacred art, that art can be sanctifying, is apostolic, and it's good. That's simply the second point. Now, the third thing that it articulates the council is that veneration is truly distinct from worship. Quote, "They are to be accorded greeting and the veneration of honor, not indeed the true worship corresponding to our faith, which pertains to the divine nature alone, but in the same way as this is accorded to the figure of the honorable and life-giving cross, to the holy gospels, and to other sacred offerings." Fourth and finally, and this is really crucial, I think this is the argument that's going to get us to the home stretch, It is the veneration principle. For the honor paid to the image passes over to the prototype, and whoever venerates the image venerates in it the hypostasis of the one who is represented. This is crucial because I think the veneration principle is really one of the fundamental axioms of the entire council's reasoning. So when we go then from the reasoning of the council, we can summarize then the arguments as such. The first is that it's mentioning the fact that the incarnation has done something important. It's this: the dignity of Christ's invisible deity was not diminished by his visible humanity. And so the visible can bring us true spiritual nourishment. There are some church fathers who had very Platonic arguments, and Plato famously argued that art is bad because it's an imitation. And even some fathers seem to be almost, well, some sources, I should say, almost seem to be having a Gnostic theology where they talk about like the visible, the earthly, the material as being bad and inferior. But if that's true, then what about the flesh of God, the Word? What about the flesh of God, the Son, that was visible, that was corporeal, that was real human flesh? Is that bad? Well, surely not, because it is God. Jesus is God. And so the incarnation then brings in an interesting dimension, because if we can say, when we look at the image of God, when we look at Christ standing before us, that is God, he is the Lord. Well, we're saying there that we're not separating his flesh and his divinity. We're saying that this person, God the Son, with this human nature, that his human nature is not evil, it's good, it's life-giving. And so in a way then, the incarnation vindicates the visible world. It shows that the visible world is not always evil. The visible world is not always bad. In fact, because God has lifted up human nature, he has lifted up a part of the creation to himself, the flesh of Jesus Christ. That is beautiful. Second is apostolicity, right? And so the authorization to create and use sacred art is of apostolic origin. And so I think that might serve to explain then, like, you know, if sacred art is so good, then why would the apostles have banned it, right? Surely they wouldn't have done that. And so there are some ways in which you can articulate then how art would have an apostolic origin. So incarnation, apostolicity. Third is that throughout the council, it refers to how, for example, images and their veneration are part of the identity of the church. It's our family heritage. It's part of, you know, when you come to the table, this is part of what it means to be part of the Catholic Church. This is part of what it means to be, you know, in the Sonna family, right? Part of the Lofton family. These are part of our identity. And so much so that to reject them is to depart from the church and to deny its indefectibility. So once again, the argument seems to be that, look, the church, the Catholic Church is indefectible, and so it can't be wrong on this issue. The tradition can't be wrong on this issue. But moreover, it is that this is part of our identity. So much so that, this can't be an issue where we just say, let's agree to disagree. That's part of our identity. It would almost be as if like a Latin Rite Catholic, said, I'm not going to adore the Blessed Sacrament. What? Like, do you not then believe in transubstantiation? Do you not believe that that is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ? Right? That's part of the identity of at least the Latin Rite tradition. Fourth thing I'll say is that, once again, the veneration argument's important because it's saying that since image veneration is a valid extension of saint veneration via the veneration principle, saints can be venerated through their images. So these are the four principal arguments of Nicaea II. Notice that it's not saying really anywhere that the apostles kissed and bowed to images. In fact, the council never explicitly directly says that. It's saying, look, the incarnation says that the visible material world is good. All right, so that knocks out a lot of Platonic and Gnostic arguments. It says that, look, the ability to use sacred art, the recognition that art can be good, that goes back to the apostles. The third thing then is that, this is the part of the identity of the church, and the church is indefectible, all right? And similarly, we can venerate sacred art because ultimately the veneration that we give to the art is going to the one who is represented, the saint, that saint who we can venerate, right? And the council does explicitly say that at least veneration of saints does go back to the apostles. And so the council is putting all of these together, and I think once you put that formula together, you get Nicaea II. Okay, so notice once again, that the decree, the only thing that the decree explicitly and totally ties back to the apostles from the age of the council is the curation and use of sacred art. That's interesting to note. The second thing is that, when Father Price was talking about timidity, I think this is actually a form of timidity or simply caution, right? Not fear, but caution, because Nicaea II is vague on how much it actually commits to the time of the apostles. Now, let's ask the question then, does the faith of the apostles include kissing images in the sense that the apostles themselves kissed images? Well, not necessarily, right? Nicaea II largely avoids making direct historical claims about apostolic icon veneration. Nicaea II is simply saying that the apostles historically taught, to whatever extent of formal clarity, the theology of icon veneration. So did the apostles teach the incarnation? Surely they did. Did the apostles teach that sacred art could be useful and profitable? We'll look into the historical evidence for that. Did the apostles teach the indefectibility of the church and the images being part of the identity of the church? Well, we'll look into that. But I think that for a Protestant who's going into this conversation, and even Gavin said in one of his videos, look, the church is saying here that it's infallible. We're saying it's not. So just appealing to infallibility won't be the most effective way to deal with Gavin's objection. Because Gavin's kind of saying, well, no, I'm showing you a falsification of infallibility. So, I could try to defend the magisterium here, but I've done that elsewhere. I don't feel the need to do it here again. Let's just look at the other points. And then the last thing is, did the apostles teach something like the veneration principle? Or is the veneration principle simply part of common sense, as Jimmy Icon articulated? We'll look into that. Now, somebody might say, but Suan, look at the contested passage where it says, this is the faith of the apostles. This is the faith of the fathers. Believing in one God to be praised in Trinity, we kiss the honorable images. Look, Suan, it is saying that to kiss the honorable images, that is the faith of the fathers. That is the faith of the apostles. You can't get around the Suan. You're trying to wiggle around here. May those who do not hold accordingly be anathema. Oh, strictly speaking, Nicaea II is saying we kiss the honorable images because we believe in the triune God. Okay. In what sense is this chain of reasoning apostolic? I mean, is it apostolic because the apostles historically made the exact same argument? Well, I don't think Nicaea II is saying that. I think Nicaea II is saying, look, the doctrine of the Trinity, which is an apostolic doctrine, they believe gets us somehow to icon veneration, and we'll see how they argue for that. But notice that it's saying, like, this is the faith of the apostles because it follows from an apostolic doctrine. That is the doctrine of the Trinity. And I would argue that it's the latter. Because if you're going to argue really that when it's saying we kiss the honorable images because we believe in the triune God, that the apostles made that exact historical argument, that's reading a lot into the text. Rather, I think it's simply just saying, look, the logic of the Trinity somehow gets you to honorable images. And so it's not making there a precise historical claim necessarily. It might be at least minimally saying, look, the apostles taught the Trinity, and the Trinity gets you to image veneration. That doesn't mean necessarily that the exact argument itself, the whole thing was used by the apostles. Just that historically the doctrine of the Trinity can get you to icon veneration. And in the next session, in the next section on the sessions, you'll see kind of how they use the Trinity in Nicaea II for icon veneration. So notice here that the definitive statement of the council does not argue in the sort of way we'd expect if Gavin's interpretation were correct. We would expect to see the decree to try and argue that the apostles venerated icons in the same way as the 8th century iconophiles. You can read that into the text, but the explicit text, what it's saying is that it only connects the creation and use of sacred art back to the apostles, and then it uses other theological arguments to then get us from that to image veneration. So I think, therefore, Gavin's interpretation here is not correct. But somebody might say, Suan, sure, maybe you can get that here, but what about the sessions? What about the whole council? Well, buckle your seatbelts, because I went through the sessions of the council. You see all these notes here and sticky notes. I looked through the sessions of the council. Hundreds of pages. And what I found was simply this. The sessions of the council do not argue in the sort of way we would expect if Gavin's interpretation were correct. It does not argue in the sessions either that the apostles venerated Icon in the same way as the 8th century iconophiles. That's not the axiom. That's not the way of reasoning of the council. There's a nuance here that's being missed. And so I think that Gavin's interpretation here is not correct once again. So in this section of the presentation, what I want to do is look at Nicaea II's use of historical sources. How was it viewing the fathers? The second thing I want to do is look at then examples from each of the sessions, not the 7th session because we just looked at that, but sessions 1 through 6. And in the presentation I'm giving you, because, you know, a lot of people might not have time to read hundreds of pages or spend $80 on this book, you're going to get basically the summary of Nicaea II, so that you don't have to go out and buy this. Sorry, Father Price, I don't, you know, you might want the money from the sales, but I'm going to try to give it to the people here for free, right? What Nicaea II was arguing. And so the quotes that I'm having here have a certain selection criteria behind why I chose them. The first is that I'm only looking at the authentic corpus. So in the footnotes of Price's commentary and Price's translation, if it has PS for pseudo, I'm not going to mention it in the presentation, right? Because if it's not authentic, you know, we're not concerned with that. The second thing is that I'm going to look at sources before the 7th and 8th centuries. So before the 600s and before the 700s, because I want to just see how far back we can go with the evidences. And somebody might say, oh, well, Suan, the 7th century, that's too late. Okay, but maybe if you get to the 5th and the 4th and the 3rd and the 2nd and the 1st, that might be better. All right, so I'm not going to look at evidence before, after the 7th century. The third thing I'm going to look at are sources that are relevant to the debate on images. So if the argument is used, if the argument that I mentioned in one of the quotes is used, you know, in the definition, I'll mention that, even if it's from the 7th and 8th centuries, because that's important for the definition. I'm also going to try and find sources that reveal the reasoning of the council and that are broadly representative in quantity. And so I want to emphasize here that somebody might say, well, Suan, you just contradicted yourself in points 2 and 3. In general, what I'm trying to do is give you a general layout of the authentic corpus of the council. And so I'm not trying to, you know, follow these rules, let's say, so strictly, except the authenticity criterion. But everything else, I'm trying to give you a feel for what the council is teaching. So I fully admit that, yeah, some of these standards might conflict a little bit, but I'm trying to give you the broad representation of what Nicaea II was saying in its authentic corpus. Now, somebody might be saying, but Suan, look, some of the pseudo sources are actually integral to the council's reasoning. So by you leaving them out, you're leaving out something that's actually relevant, because if the pseudo source says something like the apostles venerated icons, then that just kind of ends your case right there. Well, from my reading of Nicaea II, I don't think there are any claims in pseudonymous sources that aren't also made in authentic sources. Moreover, my presentation will hopefully show that even the authentic corpus is enough to make the council's point. Even if something in the pseudonymous sources says, like, the veneration of images comes from the apostles, I would also agree with that, right? And I'll explain further in the presentation once we get into the second objection, the fathers, how that can be true without having that necessarily being the same thing as how 8th century icon veneration looked. You can say that the apostles taught image veneration without it necessarily looking like 8th century image veneration. The fundamental stable point, the fundamental connection, is simply that images were in some way venerated. The last thing I'll look at in this section is the curious case of St. Luke's icon. I'll explain in more detail what exactly that means. And I do want to mention, too, that Father Price makes an interesting point. Basically, in this quote here on page 3, footnote 15, you know, Father Price points out that, you know, sometimes people are going to say, like other scholars, that, oh, you know, Nicaea II used so many pseudonymous sources. And yes, there are pseudonymous sources, just as there were pseudonymous sources on both sides. I think all Catholic apologists are willing to admit that both sides didn't have perfect, pristine historical criticism and perfect, pristine sources. But Price points out here, they didn't really use as many forgeries as people think. And I would argue now, this is not Price comments, but mine, the authentic corpus is, I think, impressive, and it can get you to Nicaea II's decision. All right, so first let's look at Nicaea II's use of historical sources. Remember, we need to get into the context of Nicaea II and understand how it's using historical sources. Because for us today, we might view using historical sources to establish the authenticity of things from a very modern historical critical perspective, right? We're wanting to see all the dots exactly line up consistently over time, and that's how we're going to verify if something goes back to the 1st century. Or we want the sources to be within living memory, which is a valid concern. But that's not really the way of using history in the council. Father Price says on page 3, the fathers of Nicaea II would have found this whole debate bizarre. Their concern was not to argue that veneration of images went back to the beginning rather than the end of the 7th century, but that it had the support of the great church fathers of the 4th and 5th centuries and went back through them to the apostles themselves. Now, why the fathers of the 4th and 5th centuries? Because of the Council of Nicaea, because of the triumph of Orthodox Christology, because of the fundamental birth, right, of the ecumenical council system, of coming together universally, of being on the same page. I mean, Nicaea constitutes such an important part of the development of valid historical Christian theology. And so Nicaea II isn't using kind of a 1st century argument and then building up all the way to the 7th century, or excuse me, the end of the 7th century into the 8th century. That can be part of it. But what it's saying is we were going to look at the 4th and 5th century fathers, our most orthodox, our most important, our most fundamental sources. And based on their theology, because they preserved the theology of the apostles and triumphed against the Arians, because they triumphed against heresy and got us to where we are, these particular fathers are going to get us back to the apostles. That's very important. Now, there are multiple ways in which image veneration can go back through them, that is the 4th and 5th century fathers, to the apostles themselves, right? So maybe the 4th and 5th century fathers are using arguments that they exactly got from the apostles word for word, right? Maybe that's one possibility. You can call that the maximalist view. Or simply the fathers of the 4th and 5th centuries are using certain arguments and theologies that are compatible with what the apostles taught in substance, a more broad kind of minimalist view, right? So there are various ways that you can interpret then what it means for the theology of the 4th and 5th century fathers to go back to the apostles themselves. Is it a one-for-one correspondence, like when Basil uses arguments about images, Paul used the exact same argument, or the apostles taught something where it didn't rule out Basil later using that argument? That's a possibility. So let's look at the evidence. So session 1, it's not, at least in my opinion, very relevant. I looked at the summary to save time, and it just looked like a lot of, council bureaucratic stuff. And so, there might be some relevant things here, but it's more like setting up things for the council. I want to look at session 2. So session 2 kind of opens with Pope Hadrian's letter to the council. So let's look at each of the citations here. On page 159, Pope Hadrian mentions the Acts of Sylvester, which was written about maybe the 5th century. I tried my best to date when these sources were, and if it's incorrect, then I'm open to being corrected. But these are best approximations. It says here, then Saint Sylvester sent a deacon with instructions to produce an image of the apostles. All right, so we're having a source here in the 4th century that uses images positively, because this is actually going on into the source itself, saying that this is a positive thing to do, to have an image of the apostles around the 400s, excuse me. Now, here's what Pope Hadrian says. Note what this presupposes. Right from the holy origin of our faith, figures of saints were to be found among all Christians, and sacred figures, both carved and painted, were found in their churches, with the purpose that the heathenism of pagans, on seeing the depiction of the narrative of divine scripture, would turn from the worship of idols and the effigies of demons to the true light of Christianity and the cultivation of the love of God. What was at the holy origin of our faith? The creation of sacred images, the reproduction, the production of images. That's what he's saying goes back to the origin. Now, maybe veneration in some way is being presupposed here, but what he's saying here is, look, at the origin of the faith, they made art. And they used art for sacred purposes of evangelism, of convincing the heathens. Okay, so where's the bowing and kissing? Where are the apostles doing all these things? Well, no, at the origin, They're just saying here, figures of saints were made, and this had a valid purpose in the church. To go on, then, he mentions Old Testament arguments, how God was pleased when monuments and altars were made. And then he reads, especially from, and I'll especially highlight page 162, where he says, "Note this, most serene lords and great princes, my sons. None of the things that human reflection devises in praise of God are to be forbidden, but they are agreed instead to be wholly acceptable to the Lord our Creator." Now he uses an argument from the Old Testament. "For this same Jacob, by indeed his own will, kissed the tip of the staff of his son Joseph, doing this through the love of the faith, as the blessed Paul the apostle testifies in the letter of the Hebrews, Hebrews 11:21. He showed the emotions of love and honor, not to the staff as if it is the only thing being venerated and honored, or not the staff as an end in itself, but to the one that was holding it. It is likewise out of love and affection we have towards God and his saints, that we in our turn, when painting their honorable effigies and images, do not pay honor to tablets and colors, but to those in whose honor they exist." Now, I'm not sure what translation of the Old Testament, Pope Hadrian was using, probably maybe the Septuagint. But when you look at Hebrews 11:21, it just says that Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on top of his staff. Oh, leaning. Almost looks like bowing, doesn't it? So that's interesting then. You have an act of bowing or leaning towards the staff of the sons of Joseph, or really, I think the staff is actually belonging to Joseph and it's given to the sons, if I'm not mistaken. And therefore, in doing this action, he is showing honor by bending to something that is a man-made artifact. Oh. That's interesting. I almost didn't remember reading that in the book of Hebrews until Pope Hadrian brought it up. That seems to be something. Pope Hadrian likewise mentions the Ark of the Covenant, the bronze serpent, the ornamentation of Solomon's temple is mentioned. And then at the bottom of the next page, Gregory of Nyssa, 4th century's testimony of weeping due to the image of the binding of Isaac is mentioned. Gregory's commentary on the Song of Songs is then read, where he says that the one who looks at an image can be, quote, perfected through the artistic use of colors, just as, quote, in the art of painting, the matter that perfects the imitation of something living consists wholly of various dyes. Notice that a lot of Platonic critiques of art that some of the church fathers or some of the sources had we're arguing that, art is bad because it's just an imitation of reality. You want to go to the reality itself, not the art, because the art is just mimicry. Gregory of Nyssa doesn't seem to be using that Platonic line of reasoning. Gregory is saying that one can be perfected through the artistic use of colors, that art can actually be sanctifying. And this is from the 4th century. Interesting. Similarly, Basil of Caesarea, 4th century, notes that written words and paintings, quote, have spurred many to bravery. Art has a sanctifying use. Now, Price does say in the 103rd footnote, his concern is not to commend painted images, which is true in one sense, because in the broader context of the quote, it's talking about how, you can use images to move people into battle, and he's using a particular example. So, commending painted images is not the primary emphasis, but Father Price's commentary is a little off here because, you have to presuppose in some way that he's viewing art positively because he's saying it can move men to bravery. Even if that's not the primary emphasis, that is still built into the argument. Because if art is bad, then how can it do this good thing of moving people into bravery? So, there's some nuance there in Father Price's commentary. Now, somebody will say, oh, but Suan, okay, you're citing Basil Caesarea on page 165, but at footnote 102, it says that, there's a pseudo-Basil quote. Guess what? I skipped that one. So that one is not in the presentation. I watched out for those pseudo quotes. So that false quote does assert image veneration explicitly going back to the apostles. Now, somebody might say, oh, well, Suan, your case is just knocked out. Well, no, I think that can be true, that image veneration goes back to the apostles, but I don't necessarily think that it means that 8th century image veneration is necessarily what is the target there. And so I think the authentic corpus is what we need to run with. because I think even the authentic corpus itself is enough to get us to the home stretch. On pages 166 and 167, oh, and I should also say too, that the council itself, when it talks about veneration, also doesn't limit veneration to what it conceives of in the 8th century. So somebody might say, well, no, Suan, actually, you just gave away your whole case, because the council understood image veneration to mean 8th century image veneration. And I would say, no, actually, it understood veneration to mean a whole wide range of things. And so there's flexibility there. Once again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a one-for-one correspondence. And so that's how I'd respond to that objection. Even if we're believing a source that said image veneration went directly back to the apostles, I don't think that means the council necessarily read 8th century image veneration into image veneration more broadly, because it does use veneration in a wide way. That's important. Now, on pages 166 to 167, Athanasius of the 4th century uses the analogy of an image being cleaned to how salvation recovers the image of God within us. So notice there that, if images are these horrible, decrepit things, why would you use it to be an illustration of salvation? There seems to be at least this idea that, yeah, images aren't bad. They aren't intrinsically evil, right? And they can actually be used for communicating the message of the gospel, for articulating Orthodox Christology. And that's one of the claims of Nicaea II, that with the depictions of Christ, God the Word, God the Logos, because Jesus had physical human flesh and was visible and real, and we depict in art his humanity, his flesh, that reinforces the in no way phantasmal incarnation of God the Word. Right. So notice here that, okay, these 4th and 5th century fathers are using images then in a way that doesn't rule them out as totally bad, but actually profitable in the gospel. Right. Now, of course, Gavin might say, well, Suan, I agree with that. And it's like, yes, but don't worry, we're building up here. So I'm just trying to go through the examples of the council. Ambrose in the 4th century writes, surely when we worship both his Godhead and his flesh, we are not dividing Christ. Or when we worship in him both the image of God and the cross. Wait, so the cross, right, in some way maybe is connected to the cult of Christ, the image of the cross? Are we dividing him? Perish the thought. So what he's saying here is that, look, when we worship Christ, and we worship him as the icon of God, as I believe it's Paul who articulates that, and then we also maybe use the cross in our cult of worshiping and honoring him, we're not dividing him into multiple different individuals. It's all the same Christ. Oh, it's all going back to Christ, even if we use that image of the cross. Epiphanius in the 4th century writes, so too an emperor does not, by having an image, become two emperors, but he is one emperor along with the image. That is a very subtle nod to the veneration principle, because the veneration principle is not saying that when I honor the image, I honor the image apart from the prototype. It's saying that I am honoring the prototype through the image. And so it's not two emperors, it's not two saints, it's not two separate objects. They are connected, and that image serves as the bridge, almost like, using a cellular device or using an iPad, right, to communicate with somebody. By talking to the iPad, by talking to the FaceTime device, I'm not just talking to the phone and the electrical circuitry. I'm talking to the one that the image represents, which might be my mother, my father, good friends, or even Brother Gavin, right? So let's debrief the second session. No direct historical claim is made about how the apostles venerated icons, except that right from the holy origin of our faith, figures of saints were found among all Christians, and sacred images, or figures both carved and painted, were found in their churches. All right, so that is basically what the horos, the decree of the council, said explicitly, that the creation of images goes back to the apostles. Now, Hadrian does not specify how exactly these images were venerated, although some form of veneration appears to be assumed. Many 4th century fathers also see good in images, and that's important as well. I even think that in Epiphanius you might have, and other fathers, how do I put it? The veneration principle in proto form. Okay, let's look at session 3. It opens with Theodore of Jerusalem's letter. He says, quote, the apostolic traditions of the church which taught us to honor, venerate, and cleave to the saints, we accept and embrace, honoring them as styled servants and friends and sons of God. For the honor paid to the right-minded among our fellow servants is a display of goodwill towards our common master. So this is interesting because what Theodore is saying is that, yes, we venerate saints in order to ultimately bring glory to our common master, the Lord Jesus Christ and the Blessed Trinity, right? And so that's important because for people who are wondering about saint veneration, this is a bit of an aside, but for those who are wondering about saint veneration, we are honoring, if you will, the saint. We're honoring the master through his creation. What we're saying is, for example, if I look at a beautiful painting and I exclaim, wow, Pablo Picasso earlier in his career was such a wonderful painter, I'm saying something about Picasso. Similarly, if I say to a saint, Christ has made you so beautiful and holy, how wonderful must Christ be? That's how veneration works. That's what veneration is doing. It's not moving us closer to the saint in exclusion of Christ. It is moving us to Christ through the saint. To see if this is how wonderful St. Maximilian Kolbe is, if this is how wonderful and life-giving St. Therese of Lisieux is, then how wonderful must Christ be, who is the fount of all holiness and sweetness and life itself. That's how Saint veneration works in Catholicism. Christ the Lord has given us the relic of the saints, he continues, as saving springs, since they pour out benefits to the sick in so many ways, gushing with the myrrh of fragrance and casting out demons. Interesting, because we see now in session 3, relics being mentioned. At the end of the debrief, I'll mention why there is a connection between relics and icons. So Theodore continues, together with them, we also venerate and embrace the holy and venerable images, namely of God the Word, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, who became man for our sake and took the form of a servant. Now, he does here emphasize that images of Christ do not depict the invisible Godhead, right? Images of Christ do not try and capture and take all the deity of Christ and put it into merely materials of wood and clay and so on and so forth. And that was actually an argument that the iconoclasts at Hieria used. Hieria had this view that somehow by depicting, the infinite invisible God, even Jesus Christ, who is the infinite invisible God, right? That's his person, that somehow it was constraining the divine nature. Now, Protestants would say, surely, I think that, well, that's not what we're saying. Correct, but they are responding to the kind of interesting arguments of the Council of Hieria, which is not an ecumenical council, which is, at least in Catholic and Orthodox theology, a pseudo-false council. For although he was God and invisible, he appeared and was seen on earth and dwelt among men, and underwent exhaustion, hunger, and thirst by the law of our nature that he put on. We venerate the image of Christ, that is, the outward form that was seen by men, though not separated from the invisible Godhead, perish the thought, but united to it in a perfect assumption. So here we can already see then something like the communication of the idioms coming out, where there's an explanation of how we can say, Jesus is God, Jesus died, and therefore we can say things like God died, right? Because it's referring to the person that is the logos that became incarnate, right? But when we say God incarnate, that doesn't mean it's a totally different person. It is God the Son incarnate. It's the same person. Some people will try to say, for example, that Mary was not the mother of God, but the mother of God incarnate. Okay, but it's both times God. It's God on both circumstances, right? So it's still fundamentally the same person. Mary is the mother of God. Whether you want to say mother of God or mother of God incarnate, it's the same fundamental person, God. Jesus, that is his person, God the Son. We also honor and venerate the image of the one who gave birth to him ineffably, his immaculate mother, the Holy Theotokos, and our holy unblemished Lady. We should also honor the images of the holy apostles, prophets, and victorious martyrs, the saints and the righteous as friends of God, not worshiping the material and the colors. So this is important because it's not the case that when we venerate an icon, we are terminating in the image itself, but being led through them by the eyes of the mind to the prototype and paying honor to that, knowing, according to Basil the Great, 4th century, that honor paid to the image passes over to the prototype. And here I do want to make a point here that, when we think about the connection between icons and relics and icons both move the eyes of the mind to the prototype. Okay, that's the connection there. So I kind of gave away the later part of the presentation, but I'll re-articulate that. That's how you connect relics and icons in the cult of the saints. Anyway, the Ark of the Covenant is mentioned. And then he talks about here the second commandment, and he says, divine scripture condemns those who venerated things carved, but it is condemning those who also sacrifice to demons. The sacrifices of the pagans are to be rejected, but those of the righteous are to be accepted. The sacred images, as a more material form of scripture, ought to be honored for the sake of their prototypes. All right, so he's addressing a particular kind of argument. And there, I know that Gavin kind of said that the whole kind of way to wiggle out by saying, oh, well, it's pagan images versus Christian images, that's invalid. I'm going to address that objection later on in the presentation. Let's keep going. So as we debrief once again on session 3, no direct historical claim is made about how the apostles venerated icons, although the practice of venerating saints and relics is mentioned. Similarly, St. Basil's veneration principle is mentioned, and this is the rallying cry of the council. It's repeated so many times that I think this is I wouldn't say it's the only argument, but is the fundamental argument that of Nicaea II. And then once again, the communication of the idioms looms in the background. Although God is invisible, Jesus is God and visible without conflict. And then what's the connection between icons and relics? Both are visible objects that call to mind the saint and can thereby be sanctifying for the believer. And so the emphasis here is that, if we can venerate saints and if we can use objects like relics to move us to the prototype, then why can't we also use an image that does the same purpose of moving our mind to the prototype as well, the eyes of the mind, as I believe Theodore said, right? So that's the connection between icons and relics. And that's why the fathers of the council are using relics as a way of justifying icons, because both are visible means of venerating saints. Both of them are visible. Both of them are ways of doing this particular thing. Both of them are part of the cult of venerating saints. All right, so the fourth session. This is probably the most important session of the council in terms of just seeing how much of it actually transfers over into the final session. So it's 118 pages. This is a lot to work through. So there are many quick examples that are used by the council here, like the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, the temple, the tabernacle, Moses making an image of the cherubim, second commandment against idols in particular, not images in general. God is not opposed to being visible, right? So you can't say that the visible world is somehow bad, as some sources will say. And there's a typological argument here. So the typological argument is that the most holy patriarch Tarasio said, if the old, that is the old covenant people, the Old Testament, had cherubim overshadowing the mercy seat of the ark where God dwelled, then we shall have images of our Lord Jesus Christ and of the Holy Theotokos and his saints overshadowing the altar. So notice that's very interesting that they're saying if the old had it, then the new can have it as well. St. John Chrysostom is mentioned, a 5th century source. He says, what happened was a lesson in devotion. For led continually as they were to remember that name and to keep that saint in mind, he's describing a certain cultic phenomenon, they used the name to banish all irrational emotion and thought. And this became so frequent that everywhere in the districts, the marketplace, the fields, and the streets, his name, that is the name of the saint, re-echoed from all sides. You have been affected not so much by the name on its own, as by the very form of his body. For what you did with names, this you have done with his image as well. For many have impressed that holy image on rings on the finger, on cups and bowls, on the walls of rooms, and indeed everywhere, so as not only to hear that holy name, but also to see the form of his body everywhere and have a twofold consolation for his departure. So notice that St. John Chrysostom, when he's describing Christian veneration practices in the 400s, he's saying, yeah, people were using images. They had it in their shops. They had it in all these different places. And they were using it because they believed that it had certain powers, not in itself, but through the saint in question. And, because this is so good, I just want to make sure that this is, let's see here, not pseudonymous. Okay, yeah, so it's not. I'm looking at the page here. All right, this is authentic. I'm looking to make sure. I'm trying to be careful. Okay. Peter, the most sacred bishop of Nicaea, said, if John Chrysostom says this about images, who still dares to say anything against them? Now, this might be a bit of a, nice, Yeah, okay, hooray, right? But I think this goes to the logic of the council, because it's saying we're not just going to do any broad head count of what anybody said. We're going to go to the most orthodox fathers because they knew the teaching of the apostles. And what did they say? What did they teach? What did they endorse? And through them, you will then find the teaching of the apostles. Notice that there's a difference in method here between what Gavin did in his presentation, what a general modern historian might do, and how the council is reasoning. And I'll offer a defense of that reasoning also later in the presentation. Similarly, Gregory of Nyssa weeping at the binding of Isaac is mentioned again. There's the argument of the usefulness of images in depicting and enhancing biblical stories. St. Gregory Nazianzen, 4th century, on the power of even secular images, of even, a pagan philosopher, Polemon, where a prostitute was looking at the image and somehow compelled to not engage in the evil act. And so people point out that, okay, images do have this sanctifying purpose in general. They also cite from Eusebius in the 4th century when he depicts or talks about the woman suffering from bleeding, the hemorrhaging woman in the Gospels, allegedly building a statue of Christ. And this goes back to the time of the 1st century, obviously. So this is then an example of, at least in even Eusebius, who Gavin Ortlund praised as being the father of church history, second to none. He's saying here that there's this belief that the woman suffering from bleeding built a statue of Christ and that the statue is working miracles to this day. Okay, so then that's an idea, that's a claim that, once again, as the council said, the production of images goes back to the apostles or the apostolic times. Here's an example. The hemorrhaging woman, she built a statue in honor of the Lord after the miracle that was performed upon her. Asterius of Asia, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly, so forgive me, praises the painting of a martyr, Euphemia, by a Corinthian artist. Okay, so once again, in the 300s, there's references to positive views on images that are being used. The council cites Leontios of Neapolis in the 7th century. So once again, this is one of the later sources that I said that I would try to avoid. But he uses the examples of Pharaoh, Jacob venerating Pharaoh, and Esau, who prostrated and venerated Esau, the relics of martyrs, God's use of wood in the Old Testament for holy purposes, images in the Old Testament, and mentions a version of St. Basil's veneration principle. All right, so here are some relevant sources. There is a defense of veneration as being really distinct from worship. Similarly, there is a negative argument or negative version of the veneration principle, wherein the following is said: for just as he who does violence to an image of the emperor suffers a just penalty as if he had actually dishonored the emperor, even though the image is nothing other than wood and colors mixed and compounded with wax, in the same way, he who dishonors the depiction of someone insults the person whose depiction it is. Okay, so I mean, this seems to be almost common sense, right? And actually, you'll see in the second quote down, that's what they say. Athanasius of the 4th century defends worshiping God the Son, though he is the image of the Father. So he's just an image, right? Jesus is just the image of the Father. He's not actually like consubstantial, the same substance, right? No. Here's what he says. For the image is the form and figure of the emperor, and in the emperor is the form in the image. The likeness of the emperor in the image is exact, with the result that he who looks at the image sees the one who is in the image. And then he applies this to Christ's divinity, and he's saying, even though Christ is the image of God the Father, that doesn't mean that Jesus is just a pale imitation. No. He is the form, as Paul, I believe, says in Colossians, though he was in the form of God. He who venerates the image venerates in it the emperor, for the image is his figure and form. Now, I know Gavin had previously said in one of his videos that, well, Athanasius and other figures, they're talking about the Trinity. They're not talking about images. The point is that, to use Pope Hadrian's logic, what's presupposed about images? What is the logic and idea of images? It's that, one, they're not bad. They can be actually exact representations. They can call to mind the form. Notice that knocks out some Platonic arguments that art's just a mimicry or imitation of the reality of things. And that, moreover, this most orthodox father, he's using this to defend the most sacred doctrine of the Trinity. Notice there that, once again, images are part of the Christian cult. They are part of how we as a community practice and communicate and worship. They are part of how we understand the gospel itself. And Taurasios then says, the nature of reality teaches us that honor paid to the image passes over to the archetype, as also does dishonor. So as Jimmy Akin pointed out in his response video, I mean, isn't the veneration principle just common sense? And I would add, can't we use common sense in theology? Epiphanios of Catana then says, the examples are taken from the acknowledged cases, just as the inspired father, that is Athanasius, took the image of the emperor. Similarly, Basil's quote on there not being two emperors, if there is an image of a living emperor, is mentioned again. All right, so once again, Athanasius' arguments repeated in Basil of how Jesus is the image of the Father, but that doesn't mean that somehow Jesus isn't in the form of the Father, right? And so, once again, this gets you very clearly then the veneration principle. And it also shows you that it is used in a very robust way in Christian theology. That is the idea of how images work. It is literally used to defend sacred doctrine. Theodoret of Cyrus then mentions the widespread use of a saint's image for protection and safety. This is in the 400s. The life of Simeon Stylites the Younger, a 5th century text, is read. Images of saints perform miracles, exorcisms, and cause conversions. The 4th session then closes with words remarkably similar to the 7th session. As I said, no doubt the 7th session based its final ruling off of this session. And so when we debrief, we see that the Council Fathers do say that the story of the hemorrhaging woman building a statue in honor of Christ goes back to apostolic times. Nothing is said here, though, of the apostles themselves. The council seems to suggest that since images have good and holy uses, how can we say that the apostles would have prohibited such good things? The fathers, moreover, bear witness to the goodness of images. The 4th and 5th century has a lot going on in terms of saint images, performing miracles, being used to defend Orthodox theology. It's saying basically that given how these images were used to defend apostolic doctrines, why would the apostles then somehow denigrate images and have them away from the cult of Christ, away from how the community is going to use the gospel, understand it, when these images are serving such a vital function to defend orthodoxy? They have sanctifying uses and powers. Now let's go to session 5. Cyril of Jerusalem, 4th century. Catechetical lectures are used as evidence for images, like the cherubim being protected and approved by God. Simeon the Stylites' 5th letter to the emperor is mentioned. The image of the emperor was insulted, and thereby, the person who insulted the image was punished. Notice once again that this is the negative version of the veneration principle. Now, in session 5, the council then directly responds to the iconoclasts. For example, they cite the text of the Acts of John, which I believe was mentioned by the iconoclasts. And they look into it because they see that in this story, and this is interesting because this is written probably the mid-2nd century, 150 AD. They read the Acts of John, where an icon is made of John the Apostle, or an image is made of John the Apostle, and John supposedly says, "You were wrong in what you did." Meaning, what you have now affected is childish and imperfect. You have painted a dead picture of a corpse, almost seemingly using a Platonic argument in a way that you have not painted really my form, but merely the kind of vague imitation of this body, right? Now, the text actually then does go on to deny the corporeality of Christ's body. And maybe here when it says you have painted a picture of a dead corpse, it's also maybe a reference to how even the visible flesh is not viewed as the real person or reality. And so because this text denies the corporeality of Christ's body, the council dismisses it as surely not coming from the apostles or being authentic. Similarly, on pages 403 to 404, in response to the iconoclast use of Eusebius's episode with Constantia, we'll get to that in the second section, or the second objection, the council discounts Eusebius for denying the equality of the Father and the Son, and Price in footnote 85 does defend the authenticity of the Eusebian letter that is condemned by the council. And then Eusebius and Origen are then condemned with a writing from Antipater in the 4th century. And then, at the bottom, I have more examples, but I don't really think these are relevant, so I'll move on. but you can look back at these. I will upload the PowerPoint. The Iconium of all the Martyrs, written around the 6th or 7th century. A homily by Constantine, deacon of Constantinople, is read. And it says here that the martyrs respond, so this might be like a fictional dialogue, but the martyrs respond to judges who condemn them for placing salvation in images. Okay, so there's this accusation that people are basing their salvation in the images of saints. They argue, rather, the martyrs respond, that God made himself visible in the incarnation. And so they use visible paintings to celebrate Christ's work and reinforce the reality of his flesh. Tarasios adds to the story by distinguishing between Christian and pagan images. Pagan images are demonic, and two, they, that is the Christians, do not make the images into gods. Going on then, they mention a commentary or scholion for the Old Testament. Now, the date of the commentary is unknown, but it is relevant to the logic of the council because somewhere in this manuscript of the Old Testament, they were looking at a commentary in the columns, and it says in this commentary, "For we do not venerate a corruptible image of a corruptible man. But since God deigned without change to become man, we make his image as of a man, although knowing that by nature he is God. We do not say that the image itself is God, but we know to be God the one represented in the image, whose likeness the image possesses. But the pagans in error think the likenesses to be gods and sacrifice to them." And then similarly, there are accusations that the iconoclasts have tried to go in and remove these kinds of commentaries or stories of images that have done miracles or commentaries on the Old Testament from whatever time period that show a positive view of images. The image of Edessa is mentioned. That is the image that allegedly, King Akbar had asked for from Christ so that he could be healed. Now, they do refer in the council, they do refer to this as a sacred image not made by hands. They don't read Eusebius's account of the story, but Evagrios's ecclesiastical history. And they read an account of the image performing a miracle later. So it's not the original account of, let's say, King Akbar himself, but it is an account of the miracle of the image that was known to have healed King Akbar performing a miracle later. John of Moscos's story in the Spiritual Meadow is read of a demon telling a recluse struggling with fornication to not venerate an icon of Mary and Jesus. Another story, so basically there are lists of miracles that images have produced. In response to these stories, the council says, Basil, the most sacred bishop of Ancyra said, "It has been proved that the custom of sacred images had been handed down from of old." Okay, so notice once again, what was handed down from of old? The custom of sacred images. Maybe some veneration is presupposed, but the making and use of sacred images, that is what's being explicitly said to be handed down. Tarasios, the most holy patriarch, said, "We have now been filled to satiety, they've been satisfied with patristic citations and have come to know that the setting up of sacred images is an ancient tradition." Where's the kissing and the bowing? The setting up of sacred images is an ancient tradition. We are therefore followers of the Holy Fathers. I think this is really important because when you look at the definition and you read, let's say, or the decree of the council, and then you read the sessions and you can use the sessions to interpret the decree, notice what it's saying here. They're saying that we follow the tradition of the Holy Fathers. This can help you understand when it says we follow the tradition of the Fathers in the decree. But what is it saying? It's saying it's coming to that conclusion from the idea that the setting up of sacred images is an ancient tradition. Notice that they're not saying, because the apostles kissed and bowed to images, that we're following the tradition of the fathers. No, they're saying, based on the setting up of sacred images, that can get you to the teachings of Nicaea II, claiming that they are in continuity. So notice there that maybe some extra theological work is being done to get from A to B. It's not a one-for-one correspondence necessarily. What they are at minimum saying is sacred images were set up in apostolic times, and that gets you to Nicaea II. And a bit of humor here, somebody offers to read 15 volumes of evidence, and Tarasios says, "I'm good," basically. So I thought that was kind of funny to read in the council. So to debrief, right, on what's going on in the council, Tarasios then says, "Since it has been shown by the preceding readings that the church was accused on account of the sacred images by the Hebrews, pagans, and Samaritans, the Manichees, and the Phantasis, and we have all been convinced it is right to listen to our brother and beloved Lord John, the representative of the Apostolic Sees of the East. So Tarasios, kind of near the end of the council, is saying, look, the opponents of the Christian religion, they all criticize us for images. They all criticize, and they are like iconoclasts, right? And it just doesn't seem likely that the apostles historically would have given such ammunition to the opponents of the Christian religion, right? To people who are, pagans and the Manichees, right? It doesn't seem like the apostles would have taught such a thing. Similarly, for the certain sources that argue with really strong Platonic arguments against the visible and material world, I think that shows you that once that starts like conflicting with the incarnation and the communication of idioms, that gives you a clue that the apostles then would not have been such hardcore Platonists. Now, there are allusions to Plato in the New Testament, but that doesn't mean that they endorse the whole Platonic system. And so it's interesting then, because you can use theology then, Orthodox theology, to figure out historically how Platonic were the apostles. Oh, they weren't so Platonic that they would have denied the goodness of the visible and material world. Notice there that you're seeing the validity of Nicaea II's reasoning of using Orthodox theology to get to the original history. And then the session likewise ends here with similar statements to the 7th session. All right, we're at session 6, and I hope that you're still with me. So to begin, but these people have had the effrontery to anathematize, they're talking about the Synod of Hieria, the tradition given to us by Christ in his holy church. Okay, so they're mentioning that this tradition somehow goes back to Christ, it's given to us by Christ. Now, are they saying here that Christ, let's say, gave the church this tradition historically? Are they referring to Christ in, let's say, a broader mystical sense of giving this tradition to the church? It's probably both. If their words, the iconoclasts at Hieria, were against the idolatry and worship of things created that was condemned and abominated by the holy apostles. So notice that they're saying here historically, okay, here's what we're going to say directly historically about what the apostles taught. They banned idols. Okay, so council is saying that historically the apostles banned idols, but they also allowed for sacred images. That's important to keep in mind, those two. That's where the council is making a direct historical claim. And then you could even maybe add in for a third thing that one particular example of a sacred image put up was the image that the hemorrhaging woman had made. Anyway, they just say to the iconoclasts that, yeah, we would agree with you that idols are bad. And if that was just your objection, that's all you should have just said. And then they mention the indefectibility of the church. Now, against the iconoclasts, they also mention that they are in continuity with the last 6 ecumenical councils, and they use Canon 82 of the Quinisex Council in the 690s AD as an extension of Constantinople III, where the image of a lamb is allowed, and even more so that this image is actually useful and good for the Christian religion. And so, the basic point here is that they are responding to the iconoclasts, and they're pointing out that even what the ecumenical councils taught was that images do have a valid place. And Father Price does mention in one of the footnotes why they considered the Quinisex Council to be a continuation of Constantinople III, at least in regards to Canon 82, but I won't go into that. All right, once again, we see, to quote from page 449, we all see and understand that both before and after the Holy Councils, the painting of images was handed down in the church just as the reading of the gospel was. Once again, it is the painting, it is the creation, it is the use of sacred images that has been handed down to the church. That's very interesting because they're not using the argument that I'd expect if Gavin's interpretation were true. Over and over and over, they explicitly say it is sacred art that was handed down from the apostles to the early church. Once again, they mention here that Christians did not call the sacred images gods, nor worship them as gods, nor place their hopes of salvation in them, nor await the coming judgment from them. It was simply remembrance and commemoration of their archetypes that they kissed them and gave them the veneration of honor. I highlighted this portion because Gavin does mention, look, yeah, there's a wide way that images can be used, and I believe he does say something like commemoration or aesthetic purposes. Nicaea II is saying, yeah, part of that commemoration is the veneration, is the kissing. And so my point here is that when Gavin thinks that commemoration is this strict thing over here and veneration is over there, Nicaea II is saying, no, I mean, we would agree that commemoration and veneration, they are overlapping. That commemoration under our system is a form of veneration of images. It is a form of using images in the Christian cult to remember the saints, to long for their righteousness, because it's ultimately the righteousness of Christ on the cross secured to them. And then once again, they defend the indefectibility of the church based on apostolic succession. To move on then, in addition, together with the divine doctrines themselves, our fathers accepted the sacred images, okay, sacred images, nothing about bowing and kissing, and thought them worthy of veneration and honor, and set them up in the sacred churches they built in every suitable place they had them painted and embraced them. May it so happen that everyone follows the Catholic Church and accepts all the depictions of the gospel and representations of the combats of the martyrs and embraces them, as God's holy church is handed down from of old. What was handed down from of old? The use and making of sacred images. And then once again, the sacred, the veneration principle is nuanced a little bit, because they're just pointing out that, look, the image is not, let's say, the archetype in essence. Okay, it's not, for example, I think this could help deal with objections. Like if we're saying that the honor given to the type passes to the prototype, why not worship an image of Christ? Because it's the, that worship would just transfer to the divine. They're kind of noting, but like it's a representation, it's the form. And so you need to be a little bit careful, because it's not the exact thing itself, but you can use the image to get you, to what the form represents, to what the form is. So they say, so good riddance to this present hair splitting together with the rest of their argumentation. So, it notes here too that the Council of Nicaea notes Hierea's flawed Christology, suggesting that it is no accident given their iconoclasm, right? Whether or not that's a fair argument, I won't consider that here. And then similarly, they talk about how the genuine and legitimate sons of the decked bride of Christ, without spot or wrinkle, so indefectibly, namely the Catholic Church, make rational sacrifices and pay worship to God alone. When they look with the sense of sight at the sacred images of Christ, of Our Lady properly and truly the Holy Theotokos, and of the holy angels and all the saints, they are sanctified. And in remembering them, they remodel their own minds. And they believe with the heart in one God unto righteousness, and confess with the mouth unto salvation. All right. So once again, the image moves the eyes of the mind to the one that is represented. And so that is a way in which, you can get to the veneration principle. I do want to add here, though, because something has occurred to me, that when page 464 kind of nuances the veneration principle, St. Basil really thought somehow that the image did get you to the form, or that the image is somehow, not having the form in a pagan sense, but, is really close to the form. And that's what he uses for the Trinity. Now, know that that's an analogy, right? And so I don't think there's a contradiction between what St. Basil said and what the council is saying here. I think that they're being careful. And I think simply Basil was using an analogy, but he wouldn't say, obviously, that an image of Christ is consubstantial in the same way that Christ is consubstantial with the Father, right? So there is some nuancing here that goes on, and that's how I think we can avoid kind of maybe that objection that if you have the image of Christ, why not worship it, because it's going to just transfer to Jesus? Well, the reason why is because the image is not consubstantial like the Son is to the Father, right? That might be a way to kind of deal with that objection. All right, so quoting, I think here, Hierea, it does mention this kind of interesting objection that somehow painting Christ constrains the divine nature, which is interesting, right? So that's something to keep in mind here, because the council says that the Council of Nicaea II says that this is a nonsensical argument. And it's interesting because, let's see here. So to quote the council, it's saying, in his Godhead, he is present in every place under his dominion, remaining wholly infinite. So how, speaking nonsense, can Hierea, they, blather with unbridled tongue that the painter, and this is quoting the Hierea, according to his futile conception has made the infinite Godhead share the finitude of the created flesh? If when he was lying swaddled in a manger, the nature of his Godhead shared finitude with the nature of the manhood, then his infinite Godhead also shares finitude in a painted image of his manhood. Likewise, on the cross also, if the nature of his Godhead became finite together with the nature of the manhood, then the infinite Godhead also shares finitude in a painted image of his manhood. But if the former is not the case, nor in any way is the latter. So Hyria is basically saying, look, by painting an image of God, right, Jesus Christ, you're somehow constraining the infinite Godhead and making it share in the finitude of the created flesh. But I mean, isn't that what the incarnation was, in a sense? That is to say that that Jesus was still the infinite, invisible, eternal God, even in the incarnation, right? The incarnation in no way takes that away. Right, so I think that is a response then to Hyria, showing that Hyria, even when it tries to argue against images, has to then use principles that would undermine Orthodox Christology. Nicaea II then responds to the objection that the Eucharist is the only permissible image of Christ. And this is interesting because Gavin does mention this in one of his videos. And what the Nicaea II says is that, among other things, the Eucharist is not technically an image of Christ, but Christ himself, right? It is the substance, although the accidents remain. Although I don't want to import, that precise language here, but the real presence is there. And the basic idea of the Eucharist being the substance of Christ, not just an image like an icon is an image of Christ, but it's the substance. That's what the council is saying is different about the Eucharist. Oh, okay. So these things that I've highlighted in red, these are the things that I think are so important, because this is, I think, the summary of everything that has preceded. So let me read them word for word. So together with many things that have come down to us in an unwritten tradition, the making of icons has spread in the church since the time of the preaching of the apostles. And the story of the woman with a flow of blood, testified to by various historians, shows that she erected a statue of the Lord and of herself touching the foot of the statue in the manner in which the Holy Gospel relates that she obtained a cure, and that between her and the image of the Lord, a plant grew up near the foot of the statue, which expels every illness. Read Eusebius for that source. As regards writing, very many of our holy fathers have handed down that these, that is the images, have their place among Christians. Basil the Great, whose teaching resounds to all the ends of the world, made mention of them in several of his discourses, as did Bishop Gregory of Nyssa, his brother in both flesh and spirit, in his sermon on Abraham. Gregory named the theologian in the poems he composed, which included discourse on virtue. John, who received the honorable name Chrysostom, Golden Mouth, in his funerary oration on Bishop Meletios of Antioch, and in his sermon entitled That the Old and New Covenants Have a Single Legislator. Okay, so they're listing out the sources in favor, right? Cyril, the destroyer of Nestorius, in his letter to Bishop Acacius of Scythopolis, and also Anastasios of Thuopolis, Sophronios and Maximos. Why should we mention these by name? All of our holy fathers accepted the making of images. They are speaking falsely who deny that is a tradition of the fathers, All right, so the holy fathers, they're referring to specifically these Orthodox fathers, these bastions of orthodoxy, right? They are emphasizing these sources and not just any other source. And so here then you see the summary of what came down from the apostles explicitly according to the council: the creation and use of sacred images, not kissing and bowing necessarily, but the creation and use of sacred images. All right, from the time of the apostles, then, the creation and use of sacred images, one example being the hemorrhaging woman statue that she had built, and then going through then the Orthodox fathers, speaking of images positively, using them in the cult, defending them, citing how Christians were using them to defend, their shops, to protect them of illnesses, right? It's saying here that almost that there is a development, that you go from just the use and creation of sacred images to then all these ways in which sacred images are being used. That's interesting. To go on, then, he says, yes, and indeed, it would not have been irrational if they had handed down, depiction in images, nor the reading of the gospel. For if one is ruled out, then so is the other. So they're saying here that images are the visual version of Scripture. They go hand in hand together. Veneration principle is mentioned again and again. In order to distinguish between idolatry and proper veneration, they distinguish between the intention of the pagan and the Christian. And then, moreover, they talk about how, for example, Hyria tried to defend the idea that you shouldn't depict Christ because he is the invisible God. And Hyria is confused because it's using phrases like, for example, no one has seen, his form, referring to the divine nature. But they use that to somehow apply to the human nature when the human nature was seen, right? So the council is saying that, Hyria doesn't have a really solid Christology because they're confused, right, on how images of Christ work and how even the incarnation works. The incarnation in no way constrained God. Similarly, images and the material world don't constrain God. And so things about the invisibility of God, yes, those apply to the divine nature, but the human nature was visible. And God in some way was communicating that, yes, the visible world is not intrinsically evil, so much so that I'm going to unite myself to the visible world through the precious humanity of Christ, the human nature, the flesh of Christ. So Nicaea II then responds to the iconoclastic uses of scripture, like not by, faith, I walk by faith, not by sight, so those types of objections. They respond to certain patristic citations by the iconoclasts, and there's a lot of pages there. Hebrews 1:3 is mentioned as evidence for the iconophile position, and that Jesus, quote, is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his nature. That shows you then where Basil and Athanasius might have gotten their argument for how images are exact reputations and or exact reputations in a sense, and that can be used to defend the Trinity or used to defend the consubstantiality of the Son and the Father, just as in Hebrews 1:3, Jesus is, right, the radiance of God's glory. He is the exact representation of the divine nature, but in no way by being a divine representation of the nature of God does that diminish, right, the deity of Christ. So it's interesting that at least Hebrews 1:3 seems to be anticipating, or at least compatible with Basil's argument, and showing you then that probably Basil and Athanasius, I don't know if they historically literally got their argument from the apostles, but they understood the theology of the apostles and they used it. And you see that theology here in Hebrews 1:3, which is used later by them. I hope that makes sense. So then Hyria is quoted again. Once again, Hyria is saying that somehow images constrain the infinite nature of God. And then, so that's something to know. And then Nicaea II notes the difference between veneration and worship, or veneration of worship, right? You got to be careful with terminology here. Now, veneration is also used flexibly. The word itself is used in all kinds of different ways. And in the next two slides, I believe, you're going to see how widely the term veneration was understood by the council. And remember, they are trying to defend, even if you look at the pseudonymous sources, that image veneration went back to the apostles. And that has a wide range of meanings, not just bowing and kissing. So Gregory the theologian refutes this myth in the 4th century when he bids us all revere Bethlehem and venerate the manger. Oh, venerate a material object that is somehow a symbol of the incarnation, a symbol of the coming of the Lord into the world, right? Athanasius says, it is standard for someone who picks up the book of the Psalms and proceeds through all the prophecies of the Savior, as in the rest of Scripture, to do so with wonder and veneration. To be filled with, delight in the word of God, if you will, venerating the sacred scripture, venerating the Bible. The injunction to venerate relics is also mentioned once again. Notice a wide range of venerating acts. So then to debrief then this 6th session, the creation of images, the making of icons is referred to as coming from apostolic times. In what manner those images were venerated by the apostles is untouched. Moreover, veneration has a wide number of meanings. It appears to be this: any honorable action or thought towards an image that regards the image and venerating act as being spiritually nourishing. Let me read that again. Veneration by the Council of Nicaea II seems to be this: any honorable action or thought towards an image that regards the image and venerating act as being spiritually nourishing. So when I mentioned before how maybe some of the pseudonymous sources mention the veneration of images as going back to the apostles, right? Once again, the word veneration has a broad meaning here, but even still, you could maybe argue that from simple veneration acts, like having an image in your home, believing that it has the sacred sanctifying purpose, believing that it can be used in the cult of the saints, that can get you through the veneration principle to kissing and bowing eventually. right? There's a flexibility here in how the council is using these sources. And so I want to be careful to go off of the text of the council and not, as minimizing as much as possible, reading in something that it might not be necessarily saying. And as I've seen consistently throughout the readings of the council, throughout this pretty comprehensive survey of the Acts of Nicaea II, they don't ever try to make the argument because the apostles bowed and kissed to images, so do we. That's not how Nicaea II defends kissing and bowing to images. And so that's important to keep in mind, because then that is going against how Gavin would expect the Nicaea II to argue that there would be no development. So Nicaea II does not feel the need to defend the specific antiquity of kissing and bowing to images. It doesn't see a big leap, as I said before, from mundane veneration to extravagant kissing and bowing. In fact, Nicaea II would see the debate between me and Gavin as this: you both agree on image veneration. You just disagree on which venerating acts are permissible. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, Gavin talked about how images can have a valid purpose in commemorating and remembering a saint. You can even use images to help you think about maybe the crucifixion of Jesus. They have a beautiful aesthetic purpose of making a sacred space beautiful and feel sacred, right? Well, Nicaea II would say, that's what we're saying. That images can have the sacred and holy purpose. And that way, then, they would say, you are venerating images, Gavin. But they would just say, oh, but you and Suan disagree on which venerating acts are permissible. That is fundamentally important, because we need to understand Nicaea II on its terms. And now Gavin might say, okay, sure, we can understand Nicaea II on its terms, but I disagree with how it's using those terms. Sure, I'm going to get into how Gavin views and defines veneration in the presentation as well. As I said before, this is almost going to be near comprehensive. So once again, using my modus tollens argument, I think that we see that Nicaea II wasn't trying to argue that there was, let's say, no, in the sense that we kiss and bow to images because the apostles did, therefore we justify with a one-for-one correspondence. That's how we're defending our position. No, there seems to be a kind of nuance, almost a development that you see in the argument itself. And this is so important because, remember, as I said before, you need to read past the rhetoric and look at the substance. I emailed Father Richard Price and I asked him to direct me to, does Nicaea II ever use the icon of St. Luke to defend its position? And Father Price directed me to this essay. I'm sure he's been asked these questions before. And I noticed in Father Price's essay in this volume, Acts Treatise and Hagiography, it says the Acts, or rather that might be his essay in the larger volume. The Acts of Nicaea II refer to the image of Edessa, which I mentioned before, the image that was given to King Akbar, but not to St. Luke's supposed portrait of the Virgin. That the letter was already part of iconophile propaganda, though, is shown by its mention in the central section of the Adversus Constantium Cabalisticum. But this is interesting, because if Gavin's interpretation were correct, that they tried to argue somehow that the apostles venerated icons and that sort of thing, that therefore we do so as well. It's interesting that Nicaea II doesn't mention the icon of St. Luke, because that would be such a nice, clean refutation of the iconoclasts if you literally said Luke made and venerated an icon. But Nicaea II doesn't do that. It does say that sacred images were made, so maybe you could say that the icon of St. Luke was presupposed, but it doesn't ever get that specific, like, oh, this apostle made this icon. It's just that sacred images were there from the beginning of the church and had a wide variety of venerable purposes. So to go on from here, let's see here. I would say that this argument, or this sort of argument, seems to lend itself to the development interpretation. The council doesn't argue for an exact likeness between the council and the apostles. Rather, the emphasis seems to be a kind of unity as evidenced through the 4th and 5th century fathers. They keep the precise nature of apostolic icon veneration, as noted by multiple examples, but also the failure to admit, or not failure, the omission of St. Luke's icon, open, and seem to emphasize a continuity in substance, in a broad sense. And I think it's precisely when you look past the rhetoric and the triumphalist sounding rhetoric and the anathemas, this is the faith of the apostles. When you look at what exactly are they saying is the faith of the apostles, when you look at the actual arguments themselves and the substance, you see Nicaea II is very careful about saying what the apostles exactly did. They're willing to say that sacred images came from the time of the apostles, that they were part of the cult of the saints, that over time you see that the church recognized all kinds of different purposes and powers and images, but that's the main thing. That almost sounds like a kind of development of a simple point of just acknowledging the sacredness of images, the possibility of the sacredness of images, and then all throughout the history of the church, the different uses and ways in which that sacredness was manifested. And so to use an analogy, sometimes when FBI agents and detectives go to a crime scene, what they can do is they can figure out, based on the clues that have been left behind, the kind of profile of the suspect in question. So for example, FBI agents and detectives, they can use clues to figure out, does the suspect have a stutter? Does the suspect have problems with their mother? They can figure out these types of things based on just simple imprints and marks that have been left behind. And similarly, I think Nicaea II is looking at what has been left behind by the apostles, manifested in the evidence of the 4th and 5th century Orthodox fathers who had grasped the theology of the apostles. And they are building then from those clues, what is the profile of the apostles? What in general can we tell that they probably taught and said and did and endorsed, such that we wouldn't see then a conflict between what the 4th and 5th century fathers are doing and saying and what the apostles themselves taught? So I think this is the way of reasoning at Nicaea II. It's almost building a profile, right? Almost an outline of, okay, we know what the apostles taught, and that general outline's enough to get you Nicaea II. And so even then, bowing and kissing, it wouldn't be defended with an exact argument that the apostles did the same thing. No, that's not how the profile argument works. Rather, what Nicaea II is saying is that given, let's say, this species, this kind of veneration, or let's say the veneration principle being already in effect, you can then increase and get to the kissing and bowing of images. And therefore, it is part of the valid tradition of image veneration. That's the argument of Nicaea II. So what at minimum must historically be true? Because in the next section, I'm going to try and offer actually a historic reconstruction from Second Temple Judaism, the time of the apostles, and even the time of the Old Testament, to what we have at Nicaea II. What at minimum did the apostles teach? So I think, one, the apostles, and I should specify that, if any of these are false, then you could falsify Nicaea II. So I'm giving out falsification conditions for historically, if the apostles said or did this, Nicaea II would be done for. The first is that the apostles did not totally banish images using the second commandment or any other anti-idolatry biblical passages or any other reasons. If the apostles did that, Nicaea II is done for. I don't think any Protestant would argue that the apostles did that. Second, the apostles recognized that images can have holy purposes. And that seems to me to just be the basic fundamental seed idea of what a sacred image is, that an image can have a holy and sacred purpose. And because of that, you can include it in the cults. You can include that in the communal practice and veneration and worship of God and veneration of saints. The apostles, this is the key thing, venerated or allowed for the veneration of images in some manner, but not to an extent that would violate Nicaea II. Now, these are key terms because, if the apostles literally had no knowledge of sacred images, or if the apostles, Nicaea II would fall apart if, let's say, like the early Christians and the apostles were unanimously against images, had no purpose or use for them, and then bam, all of a sudden images appeared later. And I think some scholars that Michael had mentioned, that Gavin had mentioned, did argue for something like this thesis. And even I think he quotes Father Price saying that even, a sober analysis of history would come to this conclusion. Well, if you define veneration that narrowly, then you could get there to that kind of conclusion. But if the apostles at least were aware that sacred images are a thing, a valid category, that they can be used in certain ways that are sanctifying, then that is a way in which you can get to Nicaea II and build up from there. But if images just appeared out of nowhere 200 years after the apostles, that would be a problem. Nicaea II is making some fundamental connection to the apostles. So let's look at the terms in some manner and not to an extent. So the apostles allowed for veneration of images in some manner, but not to an extent that would violate Nicaea II. So veneration is not just kissing and bowing. There are a wide number of possibilities. So to quote from a source that Nicaea II used, Leontios of Neapolis, in unfortunately titled Against the Jews, he says this, "Tell me," he's responding to a Jewish opponent, "you who think that nothing made by hands or created in any way should be venerated, when you see in your room a tunic or ornament belonging to your deceased wife or children, do you not often take or kiss it and wet it with your tears? And you are not criticized for this, for you have not venerated the garments as God, but shown by a kiss your love for the one who used to wear it. When, as often, we embrace our children and fathers, sinful creatures though they be, we are not criticized for this either. For we do not embrace them as gods, but we show our natural love for them by means of a kiss. As I have repeatedly said, in the case of every salutation and every act of veneration, the intention must be examined. If you accuse me of venerating as God the wood of the cross, why do you not accuse Jacob, because he performed veneration on the tip of Joseph's staff? Notice that example is mentioned once again. But it is obvious that he venerated not the wood he saw, but Joseph by means of the wood, just as we venerate Christ by means of the cross. The cross, if you will, is almost in a way an icon, if you will. It's a symbol of the passion of the Lord. And by remembering the cross, we bring to mind Christ. And I have in this image up here actually an example, because I noticed as I was studying the issue of icon veneration that it's so natural for us as human beings that even some Protestants might actually be doing a kind of icon veneration without recognizing this. This is an image of an elderly man whose wife has passed away, and he has this ritual of where he would go to their favorite diner and he would have an image of his wife there as if he were still dining with her. That image in a way stands in the place of his wife or brings to mind his wife. At the root of image veneration is something like this. It is so natural and within us that I think it can grow out from there and become part of the cult, become part of the liturgy, become part of the become part of the Christian church itself. Even, for example, I know people who will have images of, let's say, a deceased loved one, and they'll say bye to it before they go to work. Or maybe a father has an image of his deceased wife, and before he takes his kids to school, he says to his kids, "Say goodbye to mom." Notice that their icon veneration is within human nature. And I would ask the question, obviously I don't think any pastor would stop a man from doing something like this, would stop someone from mourning and using an image to do so, even maybe pouring a cup for that image, or maybe even having that image there with them in a restaurant as they are dining and remembering that person, or even kissing that image to remember them. And so once again, going from in some manner to not, or in some manner to not to an extent, and so that should be a correction on the slide there. Or actually, no, I just did that. Yeah, in some manner and not to an extent. The apostles, or actually, let's see here. Okay, not to an extent is going to be the next slide. Let's see here. Oh, so this is where I want to address directly Gavin's definition of veneration and what he thinks is the target and what he thinks is the cultic meaning of the cultic use of images. Gavin says in Best and Worst, his video at the 8:05 mark, cultic uses of images, that's the target, that's the issue here. That means bowing down, prostrating before, and or praying through the image to the prototype. That's what Gavin defines as veneration, as the cultic use of images, and that's what he's saying is a later development and therefore invalid. He wants to see that cultic use of images all the way from the beginning. What I want to say in response is that Gavin very narrowly defines what cultic use of images means, to just bowing, prostrating, praying through, etc. I and Nicaea II would reject this narrow view of what cultic use means. And not only that, don't take my word for it, don't take Nicaea II's word for it. I just don't think it's a good definition of what it means to cultically use something. And as I mentioned before in my previous lecture, if you narrow a quality to something like that, something so narrow, you can make Gavin's position of thinking that images are okay in churches look like a rupture as well, because you at least don't get explicit mentions of or presuppositions from sources of churches, images being in churches until much later, or not much later, but later. And so what I'm saying here is that you could make something look like a rupture if you narrow what you're looking for, and then you see it come later when it was part of a chain of a development, right? So that's what I'm mentioning here. But to use an example of how the ancient Jews used images and other things in the cult of the veneration of saints, here's what William Horbury in his paper, The Cult of Christ and the Cult of Saints, says. For the holy and righteous of ancient Judaism, the anniversary of death will also in some cases have been marked with fasting and with eulogy, and sometimes with assembly at tombs. But a bit further range of public commemorative practices comes into view, connected with biblical reading, prayer, and festivals. So in the cult of saints in ancient Judaism, it included a whole wide range of ways of venerating that saint and remembering them, and using even images and other things, other material objects. And so what I want to say here then is that I think that when we're talking about the cultic use of images, we need to understand which cult exactly are we talking about. It's the cult of the saints. So how long then were images used in the cult of the saints? That would also include then commemorative uses of images. That would also include then within our view of image veneration or the cultic use of images, whenever somebody looked at an image of a saint and used that as a way to inspire them towards righteousness, that would count as a cultic use of an image, because it's in what cult? The cult of the saints. So once again, as I say here, were icons part of saint veneration / the cult of the saints from the beginning? If so, then there was always a cultic use of images. And that is going to be important when we get to the next section. Now, to say then the extent to which the apostles allowed or disallowed, the use of images in this way, right? They would have allowed it in some manner, right? But at minimum, we know that if the apostles did not allow for the worship of images, they did not allow for idols. If the apostles allowed for idols, Nicaea II would be falsified, and so would Christianity, right? So nobody's saying that the apostles allowed for the worship of idols, but I'm just saying that if they did, then that would have been a problem even for Nicaea II, because Nicaea II is very clear that idolatry is still off limits. But then at maximum, the apostles did not give any instruction that would conceivably prohibit the later practice of kissing and bowing to images. So for example, if the apostle Paul or Peter stood up in the Jerusalem church and said, you cannot show any affection to these relics and images of Stephen, just as an example, that you would show to him if he were alive with us. Right? So you can't kiss him, you can't do any of that, you can't hold the image, you can't hug it, you can't cry over it, you can't do any of that. Then that would also rule out then the later practice of kissing and bowing. The apostles would not have prevented an early Eucharist celebration from having relics of the saint there in order to call them to mind. So suppose that in the early Christian liturgy, they're gathered in a house church remembering somebody, they celebrate the Eucharist and the triumph of the resurrection to remember this person. And let's say that someone had an image or a relic of the saint, a visible object, a reminder of the saint to call them to mind. If Paul went in and said, oh yeah, take that out of here. Okay, no, don't have that in the building. This is not supposed to be there. Then that would, be a falsification of Nicaea II. That would be a problem. But I'm confident that none of these things were actually the case. I think that the apostles recognized that images can have sacred uses and that the veneration of saints can include images in the tradition. All right, so then responding then to Gavin, I said that Nicaea II is compatible with development, and also the development interpretation makes better sense of when you look at the substance of the argument itself. The fact that it's never directly argued that the apostles kissed and bowed to icons, and that's how they defend it in the 8th century. But rather they begin with the basic principle of the use of sacred images. They define veneration broadly, and then they use the veneration principle of Basil and Athanasius to get them to eventually where they are today. So then I pointed out one, the decree of the council does not argue in the sort of way we'd expect if Gavin's interpretation were correct. 2, the sessions of the council do not present arguments of the sort we would expect if Gavin's interpretation were correct. And 3, at minimum, we can identify what must historically be true for Nicaea II's claims to prevail. And then I did, in fact, argue that the council does argue in a way that favors the development interpretation. So notice what I've done here. Development is on the table. Now what I need to do is finish the picture. I made the outline, now I just need to color it in. And that's what we're going to do in the next section when we look at the fathers and the sources that Gavin used. And we'll do that after the break. And so stay tuned. I'll be back to do more.